1963 through 1967, I had cosmic top secret, which was and still is the highest level of security in NATO. That's how I got involved in this crazy UFO field. I arrived in the summer of 1963, received an assignment to Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers in Europe, which at that time was located in Paris. When I arrived, my top secret clearance was upgraded to cosmic, which would allow me to work in the war room. And I was assigned to the operations division, which operated what we called the war room, the operations center. And I suspect you're familiar with how operations centers and war rooms work. It's the center of control for the entire military operation. And our operation in those years was from the tip of Norway in the north to the southern tip of Turkey in the south. That's what they called the NATO-shaped theater of operations. As you know from your history, and I'm sure you're aware, that Europe was divided in those days. Right down the middle. Germany was divided. You had the Soviet Warsaw Pact in the east, and then you had the NATO-shaped military alliance on the west. And that was what we called our theater of operations. I arrived in the summer of '63, and I immediately became aware, because of gossip, and the military gossips as much as anybody else. There was talk in the war room about a study that was underway. And this study had became initiated in 1961 as a result of an event that occurred early February in 1961, where a flight of unidentified objects were flying from the Soviet sector to the east over the Warsaw Pact, toward the west over the NATO lines. These objects were very high, they were very fast, they were in formation, they appeared to be circular in shape, and they were obviously under intelligent control. They came in a formation of what appeared to be almost 100 of them. And they flew in formation at a high rate of speed from the east over NATO, over the Channel, southern coast of England, where they turned, flew north, and disappeared from NATO radar over the Norwegian Sea. Well, all hell broke loose in the war room. We found out that the Soviets had gone on alert, the Warsaw Pact had gone on alert because they picked them up. All of our Air Force and radar sensory devices picked them up. NATO thought those objects belonged to the Russians. We found later that the Russians thought they belonged to us. Both forces were to find out later that they didn't belong to any of us, that they belonged to somebody else. And of course the big question is, who the hell do they belong to? Who are they? What are they? Where are they from? They demonstrated incredibly high technology. There were not jets. There were no contrails. They were circular. They were metallic. And they were in formation. They moved, obviously, under intelligent control. And so NATO SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers, initiated a study in 1961, which was underway when I arrived in '63, to determine what the hell these things were. The conversation in the lunchroom, at the Nafi cafeteria, during breaks, coffee breaks and all, UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Who, what, where, when, how, you know. Well, they published this study in the summer of 1964, a year after I arrived. They concluded that these were extraterrestrial after a pretty thorough 3-year military study. They made conclusions based on many, many in-depth research studies that they conducted, and they were thorough. It was a military study designed. Let me give you some background here. The subject that this research study was called an assessment. It had a subtitle of an evaluation of a possible military threat to Allied forces in Europe. Not a word about UFOs, just an evaluation of a possible military threat. When they finally published it, it was about, 6 inches thick. But it was supported by 10 inches of annexes and appendices. A copy, I found out, you could read the distribution on the front of the thing. Copy number 1 went to the Secretary General of NATO. Copy number 2 went to my boss, General Lyman Lemnitzer, an American 4-star general who was known as SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Copy number 3 went into the vault in Shock, Supreme Headquarters Operations Center, the War Room. That was the one that I had access to. I used to work on shifts. Matter of fact, I ran the shifts. I maintained the duty roster for all the officers and enlisted men in there. I was a master sergeant at the time, and it was one of my jobs to maintain the duty roster of who was on shift. Our shift commander was almost always what we call an 06, either a bird colonel in the Air Force or a captain in the Navy or a bird colonel in the Army, Warring Eagles, 06 they call it. And if he was a British officer, he was a wing commander, same basic grade. So I ran the duty roster for them, and I worked in there myself on shifts. And back in those days, we were on 12-hour shifts. And you get into that damn war room sometimes at 2 and 3 in the morning. The teletype machines were quiet, the phones weren't ringing, nothing was really going on. It was boring as hell. And the coffee was so strong you didn't want to drink any more of it. You know, you'd sit on the hot plate and get black, and you'd twiddle your thumbs and you'd sit around and read yesterday's newspapers and such. Well, when this document was finally published and the copy was put into the vault, I was sitting there one morning, bored to death, and the bird colonel, the Air Force colonel, who was the controller. That's what we call the shift commander in the war room, a controller. He had this thing on his desk, and he brought it over and he threw it on mine, and he says, "Read this. This will wake you up." So I go through the thing. An assessment, an evaluation of a possible military threat to Allied forces in Europe. Okay. I figured he had some purpose of wanting me to look at it. Turn the page. And I started reading this thing. And I'll tell you, Robert, that was the beginning for me. Because once I read it, once I went through the annexes and the appendices, and once I had seen the photographs, once I had read the autopsy reports, once I had studied the historical annex, which was incredibly thorough. I mean, they had some first top-rate minds working to put this thing together. It stimulated my curiosity, my imagination. It triggered something in me that I've never been able to put to rest. It was the beginning of my dedication to research this matter. The study itself was 3 years, from 61 to 64. I was to find later that most of the conclusions in that study were known by the United States intelligence agencies and the United States Air Force from far beyond, back into the early 50s, that they had learned and knew most of what the shape study concluded. But I wasn't to learn that until later, until I'd had other assignments and delved into other classified files and talked to people. But As an introduction for me, it was a stunning experience. It was mind-boggling. It was an eye-opener that, to try to be brief, I can't possibly give you the entire study. I must have read it a dozen times. Every time I was in on duty, I'd pull it out of the vault and go through it. Reread it, reread. Read the annexes, go through, look at the autopsy photographs. My life changed, and I was never ever quite the same. So the study itself was not as complete as it could have been, but they concluded what they wanted to conclude. One, there was not a threat involved. Two, they weren't the Soviets. Three, they were obviously, from what they concluded, the evidence was overwhelming, they were extraterrestrial. Four, there were 4 groups involved, 4 different groups, and they were all humanoid, but they were not human. Only one of the 4 was what we considered to be human. One group out of the 4 looked so much like us. I mean, almost identical to us. They could have put on these guys could have put on a suit and tie. And for the females, because we encountered some of them as well, they could have put on a dress, suit and tie, coat, jacket, sit down with you, next to you in a restaurant, sit next to you in a theater, and you'd never know. And that bothered the military security analysts. The intelligence guys were really bothered by that there could be an extraterrestrial race in our midst. Some of the small talk back in those days, one bird colonel one day was saying at lunch, he said, you know, Jesus Christ, these guys could be walking them down the corridors of shape here. At that time we were located outside of Paris at a little town called Roquencourt. And it was the supreme headquarters there. It was not an elaborate, fancy kind of thing. They've got one of those now over in Brussels, multi-million-dollar facility. But back in those days, the headquarters was not that impressive. The point I'm making is that he says, you know, that they could walk up and down the corridors of Satan, we'd never know. And a major said, you know, Colonel, they could walk up and down the corridors of the Pentagon and we'd never know. And then some smart ass, I forget who it was, some lieutenant colonel, and we dined together back in those days. The senior NCOs, the senior enlisted personnel, we worked so closely with the commissioned officers that we not only worked together, but we often dined together at the British NAFI cafeteria. And another one said, you know, bastards could be in the White House. We wouldn't know. And there was a little forced laughter there, you know. And then we concluded, no. The gang in the White House are not smart enough to be from some other planet, you know. Anyhow, we had to laugh because the study made an impact on all of us. We had an air deputy by the name of Robert Lee, an Air Force 4-star general who was General Lemnitzer's air deputy. He had an air deputy, he had naval deputies, he had Army ground deputies. He had a staff of a couple of hundred working for him, a mixed staff. British, West German, our ex-enemies were now our best friends. You know, we were Italians on the staff. At that time, we had French on the staff. That was before de Gaulle withdrew from the NATO. Well, he didn't withdraw from NATO, but he withdrew from SHAPE. The staff was mixed in those days. You know, it was 15 nations. The Turks, the Greeks, the French, we were all involved. When the study was published, 15 copies only. Copies went to, to most of the major players there. But it affected everybody. General Lee was particularly affected. He was a hell of a fine man. He was a hero from World War II. He was a command pilot. He commanded Air Force units all over Europe. His aide told me, he said, the old man looked at this thing and he threw it across his desk and he said, "Do you know what that means?" He says, that means that everything we've got, everything we've done, all of our technology, it means nothing. He was deeply affected by the conclusions in the report. It opened his eyes to a point where he recognized that the world, his world, will never be the same. And of course, the world isn't the same. But most people in the world are still asleep. They have no idea what's going on. They have no idea what we're facing here. And get back to what the report concluded. There were 4 groups. They were all humanoid. One was practically totally human. They were interplanetary, extraterrestrial. We didn't know where they were from. We had no evidence, no knowledge of their source. We just knew they weren't from here. They had incredible technology, which they did not hesitate to demonstrate. They could play games with our best fighters in the sky. They could fly circles around our best American Air Force fighters. They played games with our radar. One incident that was in the report where a UFO, a rather large one, 30 meters, 90 feet, came down over Ramstein Air Force Base, which was one of our major operations, military Air Force headquarters, flight center. This thing came and hovered over the runway at Ramstein. The guys in the tower were going, they were, not only could they see it, but they were painting it on their scopes. And what the hell is that? What's it doing? It didn't land. It's hovering over the runway. And then the guys in the tower says, it's gone. And the guys who were looking out of the window says, no, it's not. It's still there. But it disappeared off the scope. And then the guys looking out of the window says, well, it's gone now. And the guy in the tower, or in the scope, says, no, it's not. We're still painting it here. It's still showing up. You know, they did that. And we concluded later they were doing it on purpose. They were doing it to demonstrate their technology, which shocked the hell out of us and frightened most of the technicians, because it indicated that our radar didn't mean diddly, you know? If these guys could affect radar, disappear off the scope, and yet they're still there, and disappear out of your sight, and yet they're still picked up on the scope, it was very obvious what they were doing. The fact that they would fly alongside some of our fighter formations, you know, right along, off your left wing, and then they would fly around you while you're cutting along at 450 miles an hour, which was pretty good in those days. You know, we fly a lot faster than that now, but back then, this was in the 60s. So they did that. And then they began landing and picking people up, offering them free rides. And that was shaking our cage, rattling our cage, rocking our boat, as it were. One of the reports in the study indicated a little old Danish farmer one day having lunch with his wife, and he heard a commotion in the barnyard. I can just almost picture him getting up with his bib around his neck and his fork in his hand and looking out, and there's this thing sitting in his pasture. Oh, about 25, 30 feet in diameter, beautiful aluminum, kind of polished steel, sitting there. And the old man's looking, and a hatch opens. Of course, it lands on 3 legs. A hatch opens. A typically human being gets out, comes down the little ramp, walks over toward the old man and says in perfect Danish, "Would you like to come aboard? Would you like to take a ride?" And the old man says, whatever he could have said in Danish, "Hell yes." And off he goes, leaving Mrs. standing there, shocked half to death. He gets on board the thing, the ramp goes up, the door closes, or the hatch closes, and off they go. Well, Mrs. by this time is half hysterical. She calls the local police. Once they get some sense out of what she's talking about, they call the local military, and everybody comes out to the farm. Now, he's gone about an hour. And by the time, and everybody's there, and Mrs., now you must have, imagined this. Come now. You can't possibly mean what you've just been telling us. And about that time, this thing comes in, makes this little circle, right back in the pasture. 3 legs, hatch opens, a little ramp comes down, and the old man comes down the ramp, and he is excited. He has had a ball. It's the highlight of his life. And he comes over to the missus and the cops and the military and all, and he's babbling about what happened. Well, the thing, ramp goes up, the door closes, the hatch. The description, apparently, it was an iris of some kind that would close and open. Flies away. But of course, the cops and the military are taking pictures. Well, they had pictures of the thing. Anyhow, this is one of the incidents in the study. There were many others. An Italian Air Force sergeant was offered a ride one night at an Italian air base in northern Italy. 2 days before Christmas, about 2 in the morning, this thing lands on the runway. This young sergeant is in charge of security, and he goes out to it. Same thing happens. Guy gets out, perfect Italian, says, "Would you like to come aboard?" The young man got so excited he peed in his pants. He just stood there. He was in such a state of shock. Unlike the old Dane, he just couldn't respond, couldn't react to this. So the guy says, "Well, they left." I'm telling you these stories because these were in the study. They indicated that we had first-hand, face-to-face contact with these guys. Another incident in Turkey, which I won't go into any detail, but we lost a jet fighter that was swallowed up by a big UFO down there, a Turkish Air Force jet. The report, the study was not, as I said, shocking, eye-opening, somewhat frightening, because the implications of it were staggering. They concluded that we had been being visited, monitored, observed, watched. God knows we never knew. They never communicated to us what their motive or their agenda was. All we could put together was what we could learn from our observations. But the historical annex was fascinating because it went back and indicated that this kind of thing had been going on for centuries, perhaps millennium. They, whoever they are, have been coming and going for a very long time. The report concluded that there did not appear to be a threat involved, that if they had been malevolent or hostile, because of their repeatedly demonstrated incredible technology, it would have all been over in a minute, because we had no capability in the 60s to defend ourselves against them. We made assumptions of the level of their technology from the observations we made. So that was essentially the report. As I said, it affected General Lee seriously. So much so that not long after, I'd say probably 6 months maybe, he submitted his retirement. I was at SHAPE from the summer of '63 to the summer of '67, and I helped close out the headquarters in Paris, and I helped move it up to its new location in Brussels, or just outside of Brussels, a little place that back then we called Castel. I helped move some of the classified material up. We had 3 boxcars full of classified documents that had to be moved. Military generates classified stuff like you and I breathe air, you know. They do something, they classify it. They think something, they classify it. It's gotten out of control. It's a nightmare. And I can tell you today, our classified security files are so enormous, we can hardly stuff them into 10-story buildings. It's a nightmare. We've lost track of some of the classified material we have. But that's how I got involved in the beginning. That study just triggered something in me that I thought, you know, this just changes my worldview. My complacency disappeared. The idea that I lived in a world that was, you know, understandable, you know, wars, rumors of wars, politics, all of the 9 yards. I lost it completely, and so I became an avid researcher. And in the years that remained to me, where I continued to maintain a high security clearance, even in the years I worked for FEMA, I had a top secret. And I would get into files, nose, dig. I badgered friends till they hated to see me show up, you know. God, here he is again. I dug and dug and dug and learned and concluded. And the more I learned, the more excited I got. And then I reached a point where the more I learned, the more concerned I became. I think more serious. And that's when it really began to dawn on me that this is not just UFO visited by guys from other planets. I was to learn later that our security, our intelligence people, our military people concluded and learned, and I never did find out what some of the sources were, but they concluded where we were not merely dealing with interplanetary visitation. We were being visited by guys from other star systems, which technologically, if you know what that means, they're not just from another like planet like Venus or Mars or somewhere. These guys are from other stars. And of course the nearest star is 4 or 5 light years away. They concluded that we were probably being visited by guys from other galaxies, because the technology that they learned over the years was that these advanced intelligences from other places were not only interstellar, possibly intergalactic, but they were probably multidimensional. You can't expect the government to come out and tell you how little it knows, because people are going to ask questions about things the government doesn't know. Well, the government knows now many, many things they didn't know then. But I used to carp and complain and whine and raise hell and throw rocks at the government at all levels. I've always been a constitutionalist. I always believed in it. Until I found out that a lot of people in government don't believe in it and don't live it. And that's a shock that most Americans haven't really grasped. That they do not have a constitutional republic. They may have had it one time, but they don't have it now. But anyhow, I carped and raised hell and threw rocks and demanded disclosure. I agitated among people, and when I presented, I speak at public gatherings, conferences, I would agitate for people to call your congressman, call your senator, write letters, raise hell, make them respond to your requests. Well, of course they didn't. And over the years I have begun to mellow some and conclude I can almost understand why they didn't, and why they won't, and why they won't for some time. I don't see disclosure taking place anytime in the next 25 or 30 years. It may be 50 years before some of it begins to come out. Now, in the meantime, little dribbles are leaking out from a variety of sources, from some of the intelligence agencies, from the Air Force, from the Army, from the Navy, from Europeans, from Asians. Little bits and pieces are falling out. Of course, the government counters that with disinformation. To give you an example, a famous movie which you may have become aware of called the Alien Autopsy. Government disinformation experts say, you people don't believe that, do you? That's so obviously that's phony. That was all set up in a studio. You guys don't believe that. And well, the average guy says, oh no, I never believed that. I'm not stupid. That was real, but nobody believes it. That's just one example. With disinformation, they can manipulate your thinking if you allow it. And if someone tells you something from an official source, you tend to believe it. Why, it's an official source. Of course I trust my government. They wouldn't lie to me, would they? Well, I say to those people, I have a piece of real estate, a bridge in New York that I would like to sell you if you're interested, you see. There are so many naive, gullible people out there who don't pay attention. But then I don't condemn them because their sources of real truth are very, very rare. They won't get anything from their media. And they get nothing but disinformation from their government. So what are they to believe? All they can do is work like hell to inform themselves and dig and look for the answers like I did for 40 years. But in the meantime, the average Joe Blow out there has to make a living, put food on the table, raise his kids, pay his mortgage. So I can't condemn the public. I tend to sometimes do, Joe Six-Pack, with your car races and your ball games and all. You don't deserve the truth. And yet, there's a part of me, a nicer part of me, who says, poor bloke doesn't really have a chance. He's kept in the dark. He's what they call typical mushroom, kept in the dark and covered with manure, and the manure is the media. But I want to tell you that I do not believe there's going to be disclosure because the subject is so damn vast. It's so incredibly overwhelming that the average guy out there, I don't believe, is ready for it. As I said, if you simply visits from guys from other planets, as shocking as that might be, they could take it. Other stars, that would shake up some of our scientists who says you can't get there from here or here from there, but they would eventually accept it. Other galaxies, only a few of the advanced quantum physicists would be able to understand that. Other dimensions, only now are scientists like Michio Kaku, the brilliant physicist in New York, is beginning to talk about multiple dimensions, like the one we are in. Kaku says there could be 10 or 11 of them. So now it's slowly beginning to happen, but that's not the reason for the cover-up. The cover-up is being maintained and will continue to be maintained for three basic reasons, I think. Economic, because if the truth were to come out and the knowledge, the fact that we now have some of the goodies that they have in energy sources, 0-point energy is the point I'm trying to make here. If that were to come out, the world economy would collapse because our economy is based on oil right now. You cannot introduce another energy system without shaking up the whole house of cards, you see. All right, that's one reason why the lid is still being kept on. The other is sociological, is that there are a lot of people who are not prepared to accept, good God, they can't accept black neighbors down the street. They can't accept a Muslim family who just moved in. They can't accept, somebody from Mexico who doesn't speak English. How in the hell are they going to accept intelligent humans, humanoids, races from other planets, other stars, other galaxies that don't look like them at all? Of course, you've always got the one group that looks exactly like us. How do you tell them they could be sitting next to you in the restaurant? You're disturbing their paradigm, you see. You're upsetting their apple cart, and they don't like that. You cannot upset someone's apple cart without he either gets out of his chair and slaps the hell out of you, or throws rocks through your window or something. The last reason, and I have always believed it's probably the major reason for the cover-up, are the theological implications. How do you tell a Southern Baptist, a fundamentalist, a Christian who fears and dislikes Muslims, who fears and dislikes Catholics, who fears and dislikes Hindus, don't trust them? How do you tell a Christian fundamentalist, let alone a Muslim fundamentalist, who many of them are dangerous as hell, as we know, how do you tell these people that practically every major religion on this planet had its origin as a result of activities, programs from advanced extraterrestrial intelligence? How do you tell a Christian fundamentalist that beautiful young man from Galilee 2,000 years ago, that his birth, his life, his death, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, the transfiguration was all real and it all happened, but it was orchestrated by an advanced extraterrestrial intelligence? How do you get that word out to people? You don't, because they're not ready for it yet. Now, do you see what I'm trying to say? Why this is the greatest story in human history? How do you tell people that you and I and we, all of us, are genetic hybrids? That we are not the product of evolution? Evolution is real. It exists. It happens. But human beings, there have been what many of the scholars are saying, interference, intelligent interference in the development of the human genome. That the human being today, what we call Homo sapiens sapiens, the thinking ape, we are a hybrid, and we have been genetically manipulated into who and what we are by advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. There are people who are not ready to hear that. Most traditional Darwinists are not ready to hear that. But there has been intelligent intervention, and we've got proof. One of the things I neglected to say is that we now have a rather intimate, ongoing relationship with one of those groups. Group it is, whether it's the one that look exactly like we are, or we do, or whether it's one of the others. But our black government, not the one you're familiar with. The average American is familiar with, you know, the executive, legislative, judicial, you know. We elect congressmen, we elect senators, we go through the whoop-de-doo every 4 years, we go through the whoop-de-doo every 2 years for the House. That's not the government. The government is different, it's separate, and it's completely black. You can't tell that to people either because they don't want to hear it. They're not ready to accept the idea that their government is not the government they thought they had. They're not ready to accept, even though the evidence has been released, that there's $100 billion of their tax money that's black budget money every year where there's no accountability. Now, Congress ought to be hung up and dried. Those guys are guilty of a crime. I call it criminal negligence, because one of their jobs is to monitor the budget, to monitor the expenses of your tax money. But there's $100 billion, it may be more now, but there's $100 billion of your tax money annually that's unaccountable. No audits, no accountability. Senator Joe Smo can't go up to somebody in the budget department and say, where the hell is this money going? Well, if he gets an honest answer, they'll say, well, Senator, we can't tell you. Or if he gets a typical answer, he says, well, Senator, we don't know. It was in the newspapers here a year ago. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but the Department of Defense lost $500 billion in 2 years that they couldn't account for. Now, this is not the $100 billion of black budget money that goes to black programs. They lost $500 billion and couldn't account for it and had the gall to admit it. You see, anyhow, I get off in these tangents because this really ticks me off. Oh, I've learned so much that, you know, it really is, it's tainted my attitudes a bit. But here I am. I've learned quite a bit. I've learned things I probably wish the hell now I didn't know. I like the old song, I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. But you can't unlearn things that you've learned. And I have no one to blame but myself because I went after it and dug into it, insisted I find out, wanting to know. We live in a universe apparently that's teeming with intelligent life. I mean teeming with it. Planets, star systems, solar systems, everywhere. Life forms from the lowest level to probably the highest level, which we would refer to as a divinity, maybe. People are not ready for that yet. It's going to take another few years. It's going to take some more schooling. It's going to take what I always said was an expansion of human consciousness. And one of the reasons I spoke out, and still have speaking out like I am with you, is that I have always believed that understanding some of this, becoming aware of some of this, opening your heart and mind to this, would bring about an expansion of human consciousness which might bring us together as a species and as a race, because we are all the same. We are all brothers, cousins, we're all the same family. And we've got to stop this stupid killing and these absurd wars, and we've got to come together, or we might literally annihilate ourselves from this sweet planet. And if we don't do that, we're going to make this planet so unlivable that nobody will want to live on it. because we have the capability of doing that. But there is another factor at work here. One is some of these groups appear to have, I don't know whether you would call it a custodial attitude toward us, to the planet and to the species, because they have been continually genetically manipulating us for some time. That manipulation is still underway. It's the answer, it's the solution to the abduction problem, which many people are now beginning to take seriously and to pay attention to. A dear friend of mine who died hit by a drunken driver in London, Professor John Mack from Harvard, had written a book called Abductions, where John was a psychiatrist at Harvard, a tenured professor at Harvard, a man of tremendous intellect and a man of great spirit and soul, had concluded that the abduction phenomenon was a result of an ongoing genetic manipulation. So these groups that are interested in us, at least seem to show some benevolence, I think would probably step in and keep us from blowing the hell out of ourselves if push come to shove. If we had time, I would tell you stories where they have interfered at American intercontinental ballistic missile bases, at Soviet ICBM bases, where they have made their presence known, where they have indicated subtly, overtly, scaring the hell out of these guys, that they're there and they're paying attention. Incidents happened in the Soviet Union before it collapsed. Incidents happened all over the northern US at ICBM bases, where they came down, hovered over the silos, and played hell with the electronics. Pictures were taken. Hundreds of witnesses watched them. It's highly classified. You'll never hear that, except from whistleblowers and big mouths like me. So you see, we're dealing with a big, big story. It's not just them. As I said, if it was that simple, it would probably been out some time back. It's really about us. It's who we are, what we are, how we came to be, and where we might end up going sometime. I've always believed our destiny is in the stars. That's a hope that I have, that generations yet to come will travel out there and will become a part of that community. That's a dream that I won't live to see, but it's a dream I hold dear, that we'll make it, that we will survive as a species, because I think we've got some, as I jokingly say, we have some good friends in high places. Now I want to wrap up with one comment. I've shared this information about what we've learned and what the government knows. I say government, the black government. About, for example, the life of the young man from Galilee. We've been given some information, pretty reliable, about his life and about those who orchestrated it. From the birth, the whole years, he lived about 40 years, to the last series of tragic events where they hung him on a cross and all that. I've shared this with a lot of people who don't want to hear it. And they say, "Are you an atheist?" You know? And I say, no. To be honest with you, I think that I have become more spiritual from what I've learned. I'm not an atheist. I was born and raised a Christian. When I went through the university, I turned into a bit of an agnostic. But I am more spiritual today than I've ever been in my whole life. I believe, and I hold dear to my heart, that there is a singular conscious intelligence in the universe that is primarily spiritual, that is so vast, so loving and so powerful, that it is the source of all life, not only on this planet, but on all the others. And that there is a spark of that divinity burning in each and every one of us, and that's the little spark we call the human soul. But that singular conscious intelligence that I am aware of, that I respect and love, is what I call God. And people have said, do you believe in God? And I say, no. I know.
I'm Dr. Nick Begich, and I'm a researcher in a number of technologies. I serve as the Executive Director of the Lay Foundation on Technologies. I'm also the chairman of Earth Pulse Press, a publishing company dedicated to getting issues out that are obscure and unusual. Our hallmark is footnoting. Everything that we publish is extremely well footnoted with mainstream media reports, technical documents, military records, and the like. And we believe that's important because when you deal with startling subjects, you're into areas where you really need that evidence so people that are interested and policymakers can look at these issues and really move change. You know, the most controversial issue that we've dealt with over the last 10 years is this idea of physical control of the mind, being able to manipulate what happens within the brain of human beings for specific applications, whether they be to degrade human performance or, in many instances, enhance human performance. Several years ago, we were able to take a device to the European Parliament while we were testifying on another issue that we've covered over the last decade, the Harp controversy, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. But we had them broaden that agenda in order to cover other issues, such as this whole concept of interfering with human brain performance. And we took with us what's called an infrasound device. You see it in the literature from time to time. This particular device was made essentially in a garage by, I would not say amateurs, certainly professional scientists, but we were able to show how infrasound works and demonstrate that in the hearing. And we were given initially 15 minutes, they expanded that to an hour and a half and let us do a full presentation on the effects of these technologies. And as a result, in the most significant security and disarmament resolution ever passed by the European Parliament, a major section lays out a call for international treaty bans on this technology. In the book, Earth Rising, the Revolution, we actually have a chapter dedicated to this subject. And let me kind of tell a little bit about sort of how this works. You can affect the human brain by external oscillators, fields that vibrate, if you will. And so you can use a lot of different things. I mean, you see, and some people have seen, the light and sound devices where flickering light at a certain pulse rate will cause, within window frequencies, chemical reactions within the brain that literally change your emotional state, your brain state. And the human brain really operates in 4 ranges. If you start at the very deepest states of sleep, you're at delta, approximately 1 to 4 hertz. Hertz are vibrations per second or pulses per second. So you can go 1 to 4, that's where you are when you're very deeply asleep. The next level, approximately 4.1, going up to about 7, a little less than 7. This is a theta range. This is where you are when you're kind of between that awake and a sleep state, where you're sort of aware of your dreams. This is also where 3 to 5-year-olds spend most of their time, which explains an awful lot. When you think about kids trying to figure out what's imaginary and what's real at those ages, it's because of where their brain activity is. It makes it very difficult to distinguish. The next level, the alpha level, is a very important level. The Earth actually has a frequency of its own. It's called Schumann's resonance. It was discovered in Munich, Germany in the early 50s, 7.83 hertz, pulses per second. This is right in the alpha range, which is where athletes talk about the zone, or creative artists talk about being in sync, you know, and writers have that certain flow of creativity. It's in that alpha range where this occurs. This is the ideal state for learning, for assimilating lots of information, and some of the anomalous things that happen in human brain performance. Above that is beta. This is where people are when they're actively engaged in most communications. And high beta is where you are when you're highly agitated. So these external oscillators send signals in at these specific frequencies that then the brain entrains to, locks on to, and begins to mirror. And as it does, you get the very dramatic changes in brain state. When you go back to 1969, the work of Jose Delgado, who was a an electrophysiologist. He was educated with a degree in electrophysiology from the University of Madrid in 1950. He then went to Yale University and began mapping the brain of primates, humans, and other animals to see what parts of the brain would stimulate various activity. And in those days, 1969, he used implant technology to stimulate. Then he used a radio frequency transmitter, sent a small electric current, caused certain effects. And he demonstrated some of these effects in one instance in a book called Psycho-Civilized Society, published in 1969, written by Delgado. He shows an image of a charging bull, and he throws the switch as it gets a couple feet from him, and it stops. Not dead, but dead in its tracks. It stops. He then continued to evolve the technology, and by the mid-'80s, he reported in scientific literature the fact that he could create the same effect with no implant at all, no physical contact with the subject, and he was able to take primates and humans from lethargic, passive to highly aggressive, like flipping on and off a light switch. And what he used was a radio frequency at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces. Now let me put that in perspective. When you think about where we're all standing right now, wherever we are on the planet, there is 200 million times more radio frequency energy around us than what the Earth produces. And yet 1/50th in the right window frequency can trigger these cascades, this change in brain activity. And what they found is certain window frequencies, certain frequencies were active. It's almost like, in fact it is like, dialing through the radio station and you get resonance between the transmitter and receiver and you get a nice clear signal, everything's working together and you get the signal and you hear the station. In between is static. Well, most of the energy around us is the static. But when it hits these frequencies, tremendous changes can occur. Many will remember a number of years ago an incident in Japan where they were showing a cartoon on television, kids sitting reasonably distant, and the idea is the energy dissipates, it's very little energy by the time you're 10 feet away. But the flicker rate sent 700 children to the hospital with epileptic seizures, and it was thought to be harmless. It's not harmless. It's the frequency that's irrelevant. And so the military, back in 1985, contracted the University of Utah to put together what's called the Radio Frequency Dosimetry Handbook, which is the dosages of radio frequency energy and what kind of energy and what waveform shapes, pulse rates, etc., affect each organ of the body, from the brain, the heart, the liver, the lungs, so you can override those natural functions with these external signals to either degrade the organs or improve or stabilize their function. Unfortunately, most of this research rests with the military, and as a consequence it's used for the wrong applications in our opinion, because these breakthroughs could offer great opportunities in the health professions and in other professions in really overcoming the problems that the world is facing today. When you think about radio frequency energy as a means for influencing behavior, you can go back to 1973, and there was a book called Between Two Ages written by Zbigniew Brzezinski when he was at Columbia University. This is before he became National Security Advisor to U.S. President Jimmy Carter. And what he said in this book, and if you look it up, you can find it, I think it's on either page 56 or 57, it's right in that range, and you'll see this quote where he says, if we can ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere, this layer that begins about 30 miles above the Earth's surface that's responsible for the character and quality of radio transmission, if we could ever trigger that to oscillate in such a way, he said, we could alter the emotional state of large percentage of the population over huge geographic areas. And he was quoting from J.F. Gordon MacDonald, who was a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson and a professor at UCLA, who had written about this concept. And the oscillating of the ionosphere is now possible. Through our earlier work on Harp, and those interested in that can go to our website, get plenty of information, and begin to understand that issue. But the book itself contains 350 footnoted sources that really get into the meat of this issue. But mind control, we consider, for us, our next effort, because Harp was a major effort over 10 years. We're continuing that effort. But this idea that people can artificially interfere with human brain performance, thereby interfering with free will, is something that in most religious traditions, even God won't do. And yet our government is pursuing this for the interest, military interest, rather than enhancing human performance. On the other side are the civilian researchers. You have researchers that have developed binaural beat, which is a patented technology, which creates, the ears, we can't hear these very low frequency signals. Our ears just don't work at those low frequencies. So what happens with binaural beat, you send a signal in at say 16,000 hertz or pulses per second or vibrations per second in one ear, 16,000 and say 7 in the other. They cancel and leave a beat frequency of 7 hertz. The brain locks onto that frequency. Both hemispheres of the brain begin to resonate together, which means the creative side and the analytical side are working together. It elevates IQ. It brings the best of intuition with the analytical mind, what the creator, however we perceive that, really intended, both sides to work together. And little children, you see that. You see energy distributions across the brain, relatively uniform. I mean, where there's lots of energy spread on both sides. As we begin to educate them through our system, they tend to drift one way or the other. Young girls tend to become more creative and emotional and that kind of thing, whereas boys are treated differently, so they become more analytical. And we're starting to see changes there finally. I mean, society is changing, but unfortunately, it's drifting more to the analytical side because these creative concepts in terms of utilizing technologies for the brain are not being applied. With the exception of the Minneapolis School District and some others now copying their program, they actually put in what's called brain biofeedback or neurobiofeedback systems. These systems allow, for instance, for children, because children are a little bit tougher to work with, they made these little helmets that kind of look like a bicycle helmet. They have electrodes in a number of locations to map or really monitor brain activity. Then on a screen, they might have something like a bouncing ball. And the idea is for the kid to learn how to bounce the ball into a certain range. In that ideal state for learning at will, something most of us can't even do. After a year, 80% of the student population within that school was off of all psychoactive drugs. No need for Ritalin anymore. They could move back in. Number of them, perhaps not 80% the first year, but a number of them, and eventually most of them were able to move into regular education classes. Now, you think about that technology for the child and the parents, and it's phenomenal. It changes lives. Think about it from your own self-interest. If you're a taxpayer, it costs 3, 4, 5 times as much to educate a special needs child. This technology, be a committee of one and do something in your community, contact the Minneapolis School District, inquire about brain biofeedback and neurobiofeedback. There's 14,000 school districts in this country. Get the information to your school district and make a difference and apply the technology in the right way. In terms of the military applications of this technology, we should view it from the lens in which it's focused. It's evil, it's wrong, it's an incorrect approach. It's about control, it's about power, it's about the very things that most principled people would stand against. The whole concept of this type of technology, when it's used properly, could offer great advantages on an individual basis. But when governments are in control, and again going back to Zbigniew Brzezinski's ideas, what he basically said in predicting in 1973, and if you read the book Between Two Ages, you'll see it, is he predicts the trends economically, socially, politically for the next 30 years. You read it today in 2005, and it's like a history of what has happened since 1973. In this particular area of technology, and this was the whole crux of the book, was the idea that technology would give greater and greater and greater control to governments over individuals, personal liberty, and freedom. And what Zbigniew said is no matter who was in power, liberal or conservative, the temptation to use this technology to further their own political ends would be greater than the good sense to refrain. And I think we've seen that. If you go back to the 60s, you'll see the MKultra programs, the 70s, the MKultra programs. These were mind control programs that are reported. You'll see the congressional report in 1975 when the CIA was investigated. They had used chemicals primarily, hallucinogenics on 8,000 servicemen, hundreds of civilians, unwitting victims of this technology. In fact, when you get into unwitting victims, Secretary of Energy O'Leary under the Clinton administration said that over 500,000 Americans over a 40-year period had been victims of various kinds of human experimentation within the United States without consent. That's what they admit to. Yet not one single solitary soul has ever stood before a jury of their peers and been accountable for that. Well, at the same time, at the end of World War II, human experiment on human beings resulted in hanging. That was the penalty. Today, it's hidden from public view. It's the secrecy syndrome that gets to the root of these issues. It has to be pried open. We have to gain control of our government. And in modern society, what makes a government strong? It's the technology they command. So within a democratic republic, What makes people strong is dictating what those technologies translate to, not government imposing those technologies on us for abuse, for control, for manipulation, which is exactly what's happening today.